E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangatanga maha no ngā hoe whā. Ke oku rangatira e oku hoa mahi, koutou katoa kua rawi ka mai nei I tēnei wā, tēnā koutou a tēnā tātou katoa. Ko tiritiri o te moana te maunga e whakamaru nei ahau. Ko waimakariri te awa e mahia nei aku mā harahara. No te raki o airangi me kōtirana o ku tipuna, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o te whanganui atara e noho nei au. Ko ware mawhō ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning and welcome to this briefing on the decisions on the Input Methodologies review for electricity, gas and airport businesses regulated under Part 4 of the Commerce Act. My name is Vare Mawhō, I'm a Commissioner and I lead Part 4 Division, which is responsible for regulating energy networks and airport businesses at the Commerce Commission. I'd like to acknowledge the Input Methodologies team and all their hard work on the review over the last 2 years. E ki ana te whakatauki, he manga wai, koia kia kore e whitikia. I'm joined this morning by Dane Gunnell, who's Head of Price Quality Regulation at the Commission. Dane will be moderating the questions we received during the presentation. Also with me is Callum Gunn, who's Principal Advisor in the Infrastructure Regulation Branch. Callum will be joining me when we answer your questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to note that this briefing is being recorded and will be available on our website later today. So first, an outline of what we'll be covering today. I'll start with an overview of the Input Methodologies, our review process and decision-making framework. Many of you will be familiar with a lot of this. Then I'll briefly discuss how the operating landscape has changed for energy and airport businesses since 2016. I'll then move on to outline our final decisions in the context of change and uncertainty, incentivising efficient investments, and cash flows and inflation. As I mentioned, we've set aside some time at the end of the presentation for your questions. We will be using Slido to take the questions. You can access this using the link in the chat or by scanning the QR code which is on the screen now. Please send through any questions you have, and once I've finished the presentation, Callum and I will respond to them. I'd like to begin with some context about the Input Methodologies, for those less familiar with the topic. The Input Methodologies, or IMs, are the foundations of the Commission's regulation of electricity line services, gas pipeline services, and specified airport services under Part 4 of the Commerce Act. Putting it very simply, the Commerce Act sets out the purpose of regulation, the IMs describe how we will achieve that purpose, and our decisions on price path and information disclosure requirements implement the IMs. We set the IMs separately ahead of our specific regulatory decisions. This helps provide certainty about how we will regulate specified sectors under Part 4 and promotes the long-term benefit of consumers. This is consistent with the purpose of the IMs, which is also set out in Part 4. The IMs apply to both suppliers and the Commission. They guide how assets are valued, costs are allocated, risks are shared between businesses and consumers, and how businesses are compensated for their investments. They are critical to ensuring our airports and energy sector can make a fair return on investments while consumers are not overcharged for these services. I'd like to take a little time now to describe our review process and the decision-making framework. The Commerce Act requires that we review all the IMs at least once every 7 years. We first set the IMs in 2010 and then reviewed them in 2016. We formally commenced the current review in February 2022. In the early stages of the review, we consulted on the framework we would use for our decisions. We have only made changes to the IMs where those changes are likely to meet one or more of 3 overarching objectives. The 3 overarching objectives are first to more effectively promote the purpose of Part 4 regulation. This is the key objective. Our decisions must promote the long-term benefit of consumers of the relevant service. Our second objective is to more effectively promote the purpose of the IMs. That means to promote certainty for suppliers and consumers about the rules, requirements and processes of regulation. Finally, the third objective is to reduce regulatory cost and complexity. We also considered other matters where they do not detract from the purpose of Part 4, including permissive considerations relating to the 2050 target and emissions budgets under the Climate Change Response Act. When we were putting together this slide, I had a moment to think back over the review process and reflect on the significant time and effort and expertise that stakeholders have contributed throughout, whether it was in workshops or making submissions and cross-submissions on key issues. On behalf of my team and the Commission, I would like to thank everyone who contributed to the review over the last 2 years. The feedback and submissions we received have informed our understanding of the issues and the decisions we've made. We carefully considered all of the feedback that we received, and that consideration is reflected in our topic papers and the report on the review. In June's presentation of our draft decisions, I talked about pressures and changes in the energy sector and airport sector. These included the transition to a low-carbon economy, the increasing frequency and severity of adverse weather events, pressures on costs, and evolving technology and consumer preferences. Since then, the context has not changed significantly, and nor has uncertainty about the pace and scale of change. Demand for electricity is expected to significantly increase. What this means for electricity networks will depend on the location, timing, and scale of change, and on how that demand is met. Of course, gas networks are also facing uncertainty about the future use of their networks. So when we think about regulation and about how the regulatory regime ensures the long-term interests of consumers, we want to make sure that the rules are clear and certain, that they are robust and allow for prudent and efficient expenditure, and that they allow suppliers and the Commission to respond to change in an appropriate and timely way. Of course, it's important to remember that the IMs are only part of a wider regulatory toolkit. For example, specific decisions about what expenditure is prudent and efficient will be made at a price quality path reset or when we are considering a specific request from a supplier. Information disclosure requirements also help us and others to judge what is appropriate, including alternative ways that demand might be met. Our review has found that the input methodologies broadly remain fit for purpose. They are robust to the changes being experienced and anticipated in the operating environment. We've made a number of improvements, including a few more significant changes to strengthen the regime and ensure that both suppliers and the Commission can manage uncertainty at a reset and respond in a timely and appropriate way to changes in circumstances during a regulatory period. An important part of our regulatory regime under Part 4 is that it has provided and continues to provide incentives to invest and innovate. The input methodologies and our track record with regulatory resets play a significant part in providing regulatory certainty. And we expect that the changes we have made will promote the long-term benefit of consumers and give suppliers appropriate incentives to invest, innovate, and improve efficiency. As I mentioned, the IMs do not immediately affect prices, revenue, or other outcomes. This is because they are rules and processes that we use when we are setting price quality outcomes and information disclosure requirements. The Commission is in the process of considering the investment plans of electricity lines businesses, including Transpower. We will set their total revenues next year. These processes will apply the amended IMs that we have published today. One critical part of the approach to the price path reset that is not set out in the IMs is the way that we forecast and set expenditure allowances. The Commission has flexibility in how we forecast both operating and capital expenditure, and we may use a different approach or set different criteria and parameters in our approach than we used at the previous reset. We will consult on expenditure allowances and total revenue caps, but consumers should expect that greater investment and higher interest rates than in the previous period will result in higher prices to enable the electricity services they demand. So I'm sure many of you are keen to see what our decisions are, and in particular how they differ from those we presented in our draft. This slide presents a quick summary, and I'll give you a moment to read through it before I go into a little more detail. I'll go through these decisions in a little more detail over the next few slides in the context of the three themes from the review: dealing with change and uncertainty, incentivising efficient investment, and cash flows and inflation. We heard in submission throughout the review process about the challenges business face with uncertainty and change. So we sought to ensure that we had the right tools in place and that those tools would enable us to respond in a timely and appropriate way as change occurs. This includes both when we set price paths and within regulatory periods in response to specific or unforeseen circumstances. The IMs need to promote certainty about what will happen and how the price path will adapt to particular circumstances. Our regime has various mechanisms that account for change and uncertainty in the price quality path, including specified pass-through and recoverable costs that may be directly passed on to consumers as they are incurred, and targeted price path reopeners. A regulated supplier on a default price quality path also has the option of applying for a customised price quality path specific to their situation. We reviewed this framework and looked for any gaps or improvements we could make. We have made targeted changes to the reopeners, including improvements in the process of application and assessment for a reopener. These processes are now similar to the processes we developed for the fibre IMs. We believe they will improve clarity, consistency, and ease of use. One of the key changes we have made to the scope of the reopeners is to allow OPEX solutions for system growth. Previously, the system growth reopener was limited to capital investment. This change will allow the procurement of demand-side solutions. In our draft decision, we propose to limit the system growth reopener for general growth to only that which is able to be forecast. We were persuaded by submitters that this limitation on general growth was not appropriate, and we did not make this change. We have extended the types of reopeners for electricity distributors to include some resilience-related expenditure and a risk event reopener similar to the risk event reopener available for gas businesses. This recognises the need to anticipate physical risks. For electricity distributors, we have included a large connection contract mechanism. This new mechanism will be optional for both the distributor and the other connecting party. We have made some changes to the mechanism since the draft decision. The connecting party must agree in writing that the terms and conditions, including the charges in the contract, are reasonable. That is a clearer, simpler test for parties to establish whether a connection project can be considered a large connection contract or not. We have set the size of the connection threshold at 5 megawatts rather than 10 megawatts as proposed in the draft. And we have introduced the same dollar threshold as for large project reopeners. Our intention is that the large connection contract mechanism will be an alternative to a reopener, and this supports having this equivalent threshold. We consider it as appropriate to be conservative in our decisions on the thresholds at this stage, as this is a new mechanism. We can review the thresholds in future when we've been able to observe how it's operating in practice. We've also changed the way that this mechanism will be implemented so that revenue is recorded in the regulatory accounts of the supplier, although the asset will be zero valued in the RAB. We consider this to be a relatively low-cost way of assuring consumers that we are monitoring use of this mechanism. The changes we have made to the reopeners and the addition of the LCC mechanism offer new or streamlined ways for regulated electricity businesses to seek specific limited changes to their price path based on their individual circumstances. I'd like now to look at some of the decisions that are specific to Transpower. Transpower is also facing an uncertain investment landscape. It's important that we continue to apply appropriate scrutiny to CapEx expenditure proposals to ensure the long-term benefit of consumers is promoted. At the same time, we recognise that more transmission investment is very likely to be needed. We found the IMs relevant to Transpower to be largely fit for purpose, and our review of the CapEx IM and the Transpower IM enabled us to address many of the issues that suppliers had raised. We've made some targeted changes to provide greater clarity and certainty for Transpower, and we've streamlined some processes. You can see these changes listed on the slide. I will just mention one, which is our decision to introduce an incentive deadband for major CapEx proposals. This means that expenditure incentives won't apply for smaller variances from the expenditure allowance. So small errors made by Transpower in estimating expenditure in a major CapEx proposal won't be treated as efficiency related and won't attract IRIS amounts. Two other decisions relating to Transpower that I'll note from the slide. For base CapEx, we have included a requirement for independent pre-submission verification to improve certainty, and we've also extended the types of projects that can be considered as a listed project and added reconductoring projects to this mechanism in response to submissions we received on our draft decision. You can read all the detail about the decisions shown here and others relevant to Transpower in the Transpower investment topic paper. The second major theme of our review was incentivising efficient investment. During the review, some submitters expressed concern that existing incentives to innovate and invest were insufficient. We've considered the investment and innovation electricity lines businesses and gas pipeline businesses need to make to support New Zealand's energy transition. We have assessed our tools that incentivise businesses to invest and innovate efficiently. We found these broadly enable businesses to meet their efficient investment needs while balancing consumer impacts. I'd like to focus here on the cost of capital, or WACC, our incentive mechanism, also called IRIS, and our decision relating to economic asset lives for gas businesses. We have reviewed and updated the cost of capital parameters, including the asset beta and leverage estimates, and the tax-adjusted market risk premium. Equity betas for electricity and gas are slightly higher than at the draft. Our final decision for the equity beta for airports of 0.87 is materially higher than our draft decision to use 0.74. We gave careful consideration to submissions, and the change to the airport betas reflects updated analysis relating to the likelihood of a pandemic occurring and the comparator sample. This is explained in detail in the cost of capital topic paper. I want to briefly address the changes that we have made to the WACC percentile. Based on our final analysis, we adjusted the percentiles from the 67th percentile down to the 65th percentile for electricity distribution businesses and Transpower, and the 50th percentile for gas pipeline businesses. These are the same values we proposed at the draft. We carefully reviewed the material that was provided by submitters and were not persuaded that a higher percentile for either sector would be materially better at promoting the purpose of Part 4. We've typically adjusted the cost of capital, increasing it above our central estimate in order to mitigate the risk that our WACC estimate is lower than the true cost of capital. If we underestimate the cost of capital, suppliers may underinvest, and this would be detrimental for consumers, for example, potentially affecting service quality. The adjustment we make is called the WACC percentile. Essentially, the higher the percentile, the higher the WACC. We have a range of tools that we use to ensure investment is sufficient, including the WACC percentile and also our quality standards regime and information disclosure requirements. Our decision to use the 65th percentile for EDBs and Transpower reflects an updated assessment of the evidence, including consideration of regulatory changes that have reduced the risks of underinvestment. Gas supply has higher reliability than electricity, and gas is often a secondary fuel. Our decision to adopt the 50th percentile for gas is based primarily on the lower probability of gas outages and the lower cost to consumers of those outages. We have undertaken reasonableness checks using all these updated parameters to ensure the robustness of our analysis. These checks suggest that taken as a whole, the updated parameters produce commercially realistic estimates of the cost of capital for regulated suppliers. Other mechanisms we have to create incentives for efficient expenditure and innovation are the specific incentive mechanism, called IRIS, and innovation allowances for electricity line services. While we consider the tools available provide sufficient scope for suppliers to innovate, we have made some changes to improve the effectiveness and certainty of the innovation incentive regime. These targeted technical changes ensure fairness in the calculation of incentive amounts. A key change is the adjustment of the IRIS calculation to remove the CPI inflation from the incentive payments. This means suppliers will no longer be exposed through the incentive mechanism to unexpected changes in economy-wide inflation risk that they cannot control. We've also expanded the Innovation Project Allowance into the Innovation and Non-Traditional Solutions Allowance to improve its take-up, scope and flexibility. We removed the definition of innovation from the IMs so that the allowance can be better targeted at a price path reset, while widening its scope to include non-traditional solutions which may not meet the definition of innovative. We look forward to engaging with suppliers on the details of this mechanism as part of the price path determination process early next year. Finally, we have retained the IM that allows us to adjust gas suppliers' asset lives to better reflect expected economic asset lives. This will allow us to reflect expected use of these networks when we reset the price paths. This promotes the long-term benefit of consumers. Now I'd like to turn to the topic of cash flows and inflation. We've received extensive submissions about cash flows, including about the possible impact of cash flow constraints on investment, as well as concerns about cash flow volatility and the flow-on impacts for consumers. We assessed whether we have the right tools to influence cash flows in terms of both the overall level and the profile of recovery over time. We considered how revenue reflects the flow of benefits to consumers over time from investments. We also reviewed our method for forecasting inflation for the purposes of setting price quality paths and how inflation forecast error is treated. Our view is that our tools for influencing supplier cash flows in the default price quality paths are sufficient. Where specific financeability issues affect a supplier, the customised price quality path mechanism is available. Our decision is not to include a financeability test in the IMs for price setting purposes. A test is not required, as financeability is something we can and do consider already, and we look forward to further engagement with stakeholders on our approach to this in the upcoming price path resets. We have made some targeted changes to better achieve the purpose of Part 4. Following consideration of submissions received on the draft, we've decided we're maintaining our approach to index the regulated asset base to CPI inflation for electricity distributors and gas pipeline businesses. And we have confirmed our decision to introduce RAB indexation for Transpower. RAB indexation and straight-line depreciation is our standard approach to recovery of capital. This approach means that the real contribution of consumers to the costs of assets used to supply them with services is fairly flat over time. Other things equal, prices will rise broadly in line with inflation. This is more efficient than the alternative of not indexing RAB, which would mean that current consumers pay relatively more toward the cost of lines or pipes than consumers would pay in the future for the same services. This rationale applies to all regulated sectors. We considered whether asset stranding risk should change the approach for gas pipeline businesses. Our decision is that stranding risk is better addressed through setting appropriate economic lives for assets. This is a more targeted and flexible approach and maintains the positive benefits of indexation for consumers and suppliers. Other targeted changes to the IMs include improvements to the revenue path to better manage volatility during regulatory periods and improvements to the wash-up mechanism to reduce complexity, as well as a first-year inflation wash-up and other minor changes to mitigate forecasting error. Stakeholders will be aware that we considered introducing a wash-up for the cost of debt. We've decided not to make this change to the IMs. Submissions were persuasive that the status quo was preferable than the proposed mechanism. That brings us to the end of the presentation. You can read all about our decisions in the material available on our website, including in the context and summary paper and the report on the review, with more detail provided in our topic papers. We've also published the determinations which give legal effect to our final decisions as part of this package. Before we get to your questions, I would again like to thank everyone who provided input to the review over the last 2 years. It's been a significant undertaking and I hope you all have a well-deserved break over the holiday period. Now let's turn to your questions. As Callum joins me, if you haven't submitted your question yet, please feel free to do so now in the chat. Dane, what have you got for us?
Thanks, Vari. Just one question through so far. What is the beta uplift for gas pipeline businesses?
I don't think I have that number in front of me.
I think it's still the same, the 0.05.
Oh yes, so the uplift relative to electricity lines businesses is 0.05. The number itself you'll be able to find in the context and summary paper. There's a table there that sets out those parameters.
So I think the final asset beta for electricity is 0.36 and 0.41 for gas.
Oh, there we go.
But check the papers.
Thanks, Callum. Any other questions?
Still just on the one question. Give it a little time to see if anyone else wants to come through.
Okay, thank you very much. There don't seem to be any further questions, so we'll wrap things up there. Thank you to Dane and thank you to Callum. Thank you to the person who did ask a question. Finally, thank you to everyone for your time this morning. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. I wish you a safe and peaceful holiday. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa.